Dear colleagues, let us kick off. And we're here to discuss a very fascinating topic, and we'll do our best to be on par with this wonderful audience. The topic of Open API, according to a lot of experts, is probably the hottest topic in fintechs, particularly in payments. And I could refer you to the very last global payment jury reports. The respondents were in majority saying that the API technologies will impact the way payment industry will be evolving in the next 2 years. We'll try to understand where the idea of open bank is coming, what is the case studies, what is the experience, and is it possible to have open banking in Russia? I want to ask all the panelists to introduce themselves. To begin, my name is Boris Kim. I'm the Executive Director for the Fintech Association. I will be moderating the panel. We will have time to ask 1 or 2 questions after each presentation, and then we'll have some time for a general discussion. And I will give the floor to Daniil Gusev, and he will give you the context of Open API emergence, key drivers, and international experience. Daniil, this Open API has been advancing globally. Do we need any Open API? And if so, then why? I will do my best, dear colleagues. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I'll try to respond to that. I am a historian, and I studied a number of countries for the topic. For them, this is a tool to advance competitive environment, to decrease the concentration of risks or assets at bigger banks in the countries where Open API, open banking are being evolved. It is rather boring story, very little in terms of practical experience, but I can tell you that the successful cases that we analyzed for Open API seem to suggest they are moving the strategy for decreasing concentration risk, and you can see that in the UK, based on 2007 and 8 recession. The same is true of Australian regulator that's published their open paper on open banking recently. As a researcher, together with Ekaterina Frolovic, we talked to a number of experts, and I'm here to show you a hackathon-style video or an interview of 2 extreme positions, Victoria Richardson from Australia and a guy from the United States.
Is moving towards an open banking regime. And I think it's fair to say that there are 2 broad sets of initiatives that are supporting this move. The first is industry-led, and the second is government-led. So the industry-led initiatives have delivered 2 important outcomes in the last year or so. The first of these was principles for data sharing. Under the guidance of the Australian Payments Council, banks and retailers and technology companies came together and produced these principles to help determine the type of behaviour that we have for data sharing. Then the second initiative, also run by the Australian Payments Council, was an initiative to identify which data sets have inherent value. If we're going to make this data available, then we need to understand how to prioritise which data sets we made available. So we hosted an industry hackathon We had 120 participants, we had participation from the major banks, and we had some really interesting applications and ideas developed. And crucially, it showed us that there is inherent value in sharing transactional data, and that value isn't just for banking or payment applications, that it has applications beyond just the payment and banking application. In terms of government initiatives, there is a live inquiry into open banking at the moment. So in July 2017, the Australian government launched a review into open banking, and it's a consultation on how to implement open banking. And there are some key questions that the government is looking to answer. They want to understand which model is applicable for this market. They want to understand what regulatory framework might work. And they're also looking for guidance on an implementation framework. So that's a roadmap and the time frame. And the driver for this is that the government is looking to enable consumers to make better choices. And the rationale for this is that when consumers make better choices, the industry is encouraged to be more competitive and more efficient. So very much at the heart of this is the Australian government's desire to increase consumer choice and, as a result of that, improve the efficiency and competition in the market.
А теперь краткое интервью практика.
It's a very brief interview of a practitioner, and then another point of view is from Bradley Liner.
About open banking today. So here's the thing. The United States is a totally different animal. Part of our government regulatory agencies like the OCC, you certainly have an interest in providing an open platform that banks can have a standard to write to. You have, I think, an increasing interest in the fintech ecosystem being heavily engaged in banks and providing a platform for their customers and the bank's customers to interact across the financial spectrum. And I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. The challenge, I think, for the United States and for other markets is to ask themselves, what do customers really want? Why? If a bank is looking to build on a strategy where they are going to innovate, leveraging an open platform, then they need to look at how platforms have arisen. I think the reason why we're seeing this move toward open platforms is for the very reason that banks are very concerned about their business model. If you think how many fintech startups have arisen and become almost a de facto standard for the way that consumers are interacting with their finances, it's incredibly important for banks to realize that banking is no longer just developing, sitting back and waiting to do an update every 6 months, every 12 months. So standards that are opening up, banks are looking at that as a threat. They're looking at that and they are concerned about their business model, and they're concerned about their customers leaving, their customers simply going away, bank to reach out and start working with fintech startups. The reason why you're seeing that is because they're concerned about their business model being usurped. And that makes sense. So if you're a top 25 bank, yeah, I would probably consider looking outside and seeing what's changing and being part of the development of those standards, because it's coming. It's coming. And I think it's an imperative for financial institutions to be a part of that. In regard to open standards, we're talking about open access to all fintech applications within a given market. But what does that mean? That means that we're adding legitimacy to every single development team that is able to tap into customer data, TransferWise, Venmo, the ability to move money, the ability to save money in different ways. It's changing the way that we look at the way we build our applications. It's changing the way we look at our customer relationships and our data. So what's more critical to me is that banks have an open mind, open standards and open minds about the way that they develop and about their customer value. When you think about what's happening in the United States, you're looking at 12,500 financial institutions, but just 25 control 80% of the lending relationship and about 90% of the deposit relationship. That any push toward open standards or an opening up of a charter where fintechs can become banks to themselves, they act as a threat, and it makes sense that they would, because if you were providing such sort of a monopoly already within a given market, why would you be open to more standards? Why would you be open to something that would open up your business And the challenge, I think, is to change that mindset.
То есть вы услышали два
We've heard two extreme positions, one from the regulator and the other one from the retail banker, Australia on the one hand, the United States on the other. And the examples how Open API moving and developing. It is very difficult to set the narrative for our discussion or offer specific cases based on Open API, not just technology of the Open API. We want to know more about what sort of competitive offers we could do to open it as a utility accessible to all. Do we have any such cases? How this model should be better structured for everyone, for the holders of data and suppliers, so that everyone is happy. Thank you. We have time for one question specifically to Daniil. We don't have any questions. I will ask one. If you want to sum up the experience that you looked into, what is the key driver of the open banking? Is it the regulator, the demand on part of the larger player, the demand of the newcomers, or technological or business innovations like the need for in-app payment implication or Internet of Things? It depends on the regions. The advanced economies, open APIs are being driven by the regulator because they want to decrease the concentration risk and set some common rules of play in terms of access to data for newcomers, for new players, commercialization of data. In those countries where there's very little in terms of the infrastructure, the whole thing is market driven. The driver is coming from larger players like Alipay and Pesa. Thank you. We moving on to David Birch, and he will answer the following question. Do you think the open banking is a zero-sum game? If not, who is the loser, and what could be the scenario for the win-win situation?
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you again to the bank for the flattering invitation to come and talk to you today. Yes, I'm going to try and answer Boris's question by looking at open banking from the point of view of the bank strategy, not so much the regulator strategy. I mean, Gavin will talk about those things in a moment. So I have many years' experience advising not really the fintechs, but the dinosaurs, if you like. My customers are the legacy. It's Visa and Barclays and people like that. So the thing is, how do we find business models that enable them to survive in this new environment? And I think to rise to the challenge, it's not impossible. Oh, and I wrote some books as well, so I have to put that up there. It's my publisher. So I'm just joking. Come on, let's go to the. Okay. So I want to locate the what we might call the platformification of banking as one of a series of transitions in the banking space. So over the last few years, we've seen the focus in banking shift from time to time, and I think there are people in the audience old enough to remember that things didn't go absolutely as well as we might have hoped in the banking sector a few years ago. And so you see these changes, and there was an obvious focus on risk, and once risk was, broadly speaking, under control, I'm talking about the international system as a whole, we went through this phase of looking for more savings and operational efficiency and so on. And then we moved into this kind of fintech era, which I think isn't quite played out yet. But we haven't really seen the results of this yet. And I think in some of the discussions yesterday, we saw that it was the emergence of partnerships between the fintechs and the banks which might be the way forward here. The fintechs have not risen up and overthrown the banks in most cases. We can point to some isolated examples, TransferWise and Venmo and things like this, but generally speaking, the banks are going to partner with these guys. So fintech itself is not going to disrupt the existing banking order. You know, Bank of America and Barclays are still going to be Bank of America and Barclays, but with a little bit of fintech gloss put on the end. But soon we're moving into this open era, either because of regulatory pressures as in the UK, or combined regulatory and industry pressures as in Australia, or perhaps because of private pressures in the United States. Although I think US exceptionalism is important in this case. I don't think we should look at the United States. I mean, we can certainly learn things from the US environment, but I think it would be wrong to see it as any kind of model, because the banking environment in the US is so unique and special, and very inefficient by international standards. So we don't want to copy that. So we're moving into this openness era, and so we have to find bank strategies that enable them to construct new business models for those eras. So I'm not really thinking about the fintechs anymore. Now, as has already been mentioned, the crucial and I come from the technology side, so the crucial technology change as we go into this period is that we begin to move into this world of APIs, and the bank interface stops being the interface with customers directly and starts becoming an API interface. This is problematic for the banks I work with, because historically their customer service and their promotion and their marketing and their imagination is directed towards the end customer. But in a world of APIs, you're not producing services for the end customers, you're producing services for the people who develop software for the end customers. And that's a very different world. And you can see how hard it is, because, for example, one of the people I work for is WorldPay, which is one of the world's biggest acquirers and a fantastic company. But look at Stripe. What could Stripe do that any other acquirer could do? Nothing. What they had was they understood the API space. They understood that you don't just publish an API and hope for the best. You need to build developer momentum. You need hackathons and infrastructure and test cases and downloadable code. You're not selling to customers anymore, you're selling to developers, and that's a different world. So if we just look at that API world for a moment, because I'm a consultant and the UK hasn't left the European Union yet, there's a European directive on management consultants which says everything has to be in a 2x2 matrix. So I'm joking, that's not really true. I just thought that's not why we're leaving the European Union. There's all sorts of other reasons. So, but I made a 2x2 matrix because it's traditional for consultants. So I just want this simple breakdown. So when I say APIs, there are 4 distinct cases of APIs. There are the if you like, the information APIs. Now, if you looked at the results from Australia, you would have seen on the chart that actually when the developers were building new stuff, most of the stuff they were doing was to do with getting information from the bank, not to do with instructing payments through the bank. I'll come back to that point in a moment. So we have in the UK and in the EU, we have the mandatory stuff, and we divide that into the payment stuff, the transactional stuff. No one's going to make a living out of this. Maybe there are people in this room that are 10 times smarter than me, right? I mean, there was one in the last room because he had 250,000 bitcoins. He's much smarter than me. So maybe there's somebody in this room that's smarter than me. I don't see anybody making a business case out of providing the mandatory payment APIs. This is what banks have to provide to the industry as a service. This is part of their responsibility. It's part of their, banks are given exorbitant privileges through their banking licenses, and this is just one of the things they have to do for society. No one's going to make any money out of providing the mandatory payment APIs. It's just what banks have to do. Similarly, it's going to be very difficult to make money out of the mandatory non-payment APIs. These are the information APIs, like can you show me the last transactions, who does this person pay, how much money do they have in their account, this kind of thing. Again, it's really hard to see how to make money out of that, because all the banks will have to provide the same mandatory APIs, and if they begin to charge really anything for them, then everybody will go complaining to the regulator, and the regulator will end up setting the charges to zero anyway. So these are things we have to implement. I don't think they're the basis of making money. If we want to make money, we have to look towards the non-mandatory APIs, which the banks can provide as extra services that generate added value for people in the rest of the economy. And if we again divide those into two parts, we have the non-mandatory payment APIs. This will be things like foreign exchange, trade finance, and so on. And it is possible, although personally, and being completely honest with you, I've not seen any effective business cases in this space, but it is certainly possible that such business cases exist, and I just haven't seen them. That's entirely possible. So we tend to focus on the non-mandatory, non-payment APIs, and this is an area where if the banks cooperate and create the right kind of competition, they can create a very new industry. And there are different categories of these non-payment, non-mandatory APIs. I'd like to focus on one particular area because that's been raised several times before, and that's to do with identity. So one key area of non-mandatory, non-payment API that banks could provide in order to provide value-added services that are worth paying for is around the areas of identity, trust, authentication, reputation. Why do we want to focus on that? Because we want the bank, I apologize for showing more management consulting 2x2s, it's just a force of habit. But actually I agree with Accenture about that. You know, we don't want the bank to be something that just sits in the background and now and then customers come and do the odd transaction with us. We can't do any, we want the bank to be part of the customer's life. We want the bank to be part, and we want the bank to be able to provide positive, beneficial services to the customer in lots of different areas, not just making a payment. And I've just brought 3 quick examples to show you what I mean by this. So I've chosen one UK example, one European example, and one Australian example. So the UK example, one of the challenger banks in the UK is Starling. They've decided to turn themselves into an API bank and make APIs the focus of their competition. They already have their API. By the way, when we talk about APIs, as Gavin will explain in a moment, we're not talking hypothetically. These exist. You can go and download them and start coding to them now, although they won't actually be live until January. So one possibility for the bank is just to say, we're just going to be about APIs and we're going to make that our focus. Now, if you think about for that to happen, right, so that means now a company can approach me, the telecom company can say, hey, can I have a look at your bank account to see if you're creditworthy so I can give you a phone or whatever. For that to happen, we're missing an identity infrastructure. Because how does the bank know that it's the telecoms company? How does the telecoms company know it's me? How does the bank know that I said to the telecoms company that it's okay for them to access the account? So if we shift to this API-based strategy, that demands an identity infrastructure which we currently don't have. And you don't have either. So here's a European example, BBVA. So BBVA in Spain decided to make this a focus of their provisions to third parties. They have a very good structure, which is the same as the structure that I set out in my book, but that's just a coincidence. And they say we need 3 sets of services, and it's important to distinguish these. We need identification services, we need authentication services, and we need authorization services. And I'll simply say one thing. One way to resolve many of the privacy issues that have been discussed at FINOPOLIS over the last couple of days is to separate in our heads the difference between identification and authorization. When I go into a bar and the bar wants to know whether I'm over 18 or not, that's an authorization. Like, am I allowed to go into this bar? Asking who I am is an identification request. And every time you ask who somebody is, you make identity fraud worse. So the idea is to get identity out of transactions so that transactions are in the authorization space. So in this example, BBVA keep my identity safely locked up back at the bank, and they give me cryptographic credentials to go and do things that I want to do. This is a really good way to think about things, a really good way to organize things. And I'd say in the middle, the authentication space from the technology point of view, that's the solve space. We don't need to worry about that. Other people are dealing with that for us with smart chips and fingerprint scanners and face and whatever. So I don't care about the authentication space. That's a solved problem. The banks don't need to spend money on this. The third example is the Australian example. So now you take that authorization. So if you follow my logic, APIs mean shifting to identity. That's the Starling example. The BBVA example shows us a model of identity, identification, authentication, authorization. This is the Australian example of Commonwealth Bank. This is authorization. So Commonwealth Bank provide this service. By the way, I don't want to talk about it now, but providing services into the new sharing economy is a big part of the bank new business models. So in this example, in Australia, there's a service which I've just gone blank on. I can't remember what it's called. In England, it's called TaskRabbit, right? So the idea is, Olga, you would be far too busy to put up IKEA furniture yourself. So you go on your phone and you ask for a young student to come around and put up your IKEA furniture for you. This is a very popular service. It's called TaskRabbit in the UK. I forgot what the Australian one is called, but this is the Australian one. Now, when you go and look on and you say, I want a student to come around and fix up the house, what you see is you see a little mark. And the mark says, Commonwealth Bank knows who this person is, right? It doesn't tell you who they are. It doesn't tell you anything about them. It doesn't share any personal details. It just says, Commonwealth Bank knows who this person is. And in the modern economy, that's a sufficient economic incentive function to allow transactions to take place, right? Because, I mean, not everybody that works for this is a murderer or something, but I mean, if they were a murderer, there wouldn't be a very good crime because Commonwealth Bank knows who they are. So when the police went to Commonwealth Bank and said, well, who is person XYZ? Commonwealth Bank would say, well, it's Dave. And by the way, we can tell you where he is because we have the app on his phone. So you don't have to know who people are to have security. So this is a perfect example of a service that makes sense for a bank, that delivers a new service, that improves security for everybody, but does not spill personal information everywhere. So my point is, there are business models around APIs. They're just not the traditional bank models of payments and getting statements and things. Thank you.
Thank Dave. Do we have any questions to Dave on his presentation? Well, if not, then Megan. Dave, clearly you are a protagonist of the idea of identity, but I want to ask a question about a different structural platform. Is there a connection between open API, open banking, and platforms of instantaneous retail payments like faster payment in the UK?
Projections I couldn't say for the Russian market, I don't know it well enough, but the projections for the European market are that because of the transition to open APIs, we're probably going to lose about a third of card volumes to the instant credit transfer payments. I mentioned yesterday that the new payment architecture in the UK is going to be credit transfers only. There'll be it's push payments only, no pull payments. And there are lots of reasons for doing this. This is a much more efficient infrastructure. Pull payments are a stupid 1970s hack to get around the fact that everything wasn't connected all the time. So we displace about a third of card payments. The merchants are happy because that saves them lots of money. I'm looking out the corner of my eye at Visa over there. This is not necessarily bad news for Visa because I'm sure Visa will think of good services in this. Visa don't just do the payment. Visa do merchant guarantees and credit. So about a third of the card payments will be displaced for the credit transfers. I think the APIs will be built into a lot of the retailer applications. So what will happen is when you go to the store, you use the retailer's own application and they will have the API to your bank account because nobody's going to make a better retail point of sale experience than the retailer themselves. So we call this invisible payment. So I'll give you the marketing thing. So we think payments become instant and they become invisible and they become irrevocable. Which is another attraction to the merchants because this has some fraud implications which I'm sure the bank is aware of and in the UK we didn't handle that very well. We were the first with the faster payments. We didn't necessarily anticipate all of the fraud models properly. I think you have more information to work with than we did on this. But merchants will heavily incentivize consumers to move towards those instant irrevocable payments because it saves them a lot of money. If they say to you, look, if you just pay with your app, which is a credit transfer, we give you double air miles or double points or whatever. It's easy. So merchants, I think, will heavily incentivize people. I think your gut feeling about this is correct.
Спасибо, Дэйв.
Thank you, Dave. Our next speaker is coming from a bank which, contrary to many other banks, doesn't only talk about open APIs, but is actually doing something and very successfully doing. I'm asking Lisa to share her experience of success of Nordea Bank in APA.
And good afternoon to everybody, and thank you very much for the kind invitation to come here. It has been very interesting to follow the discussion. So I would like to share with you a case study from Nordea Bank and what we have done in open banking and PSD2. Just to introduce myself, I have been 20 plus years in future payments. Of course, the future has always been moving ahead, and so I started with mobile payments in '95, and I'm still on that journey trying to understand what's the best way of doing payments and where does payments evolve. It has been certainly an interesting journey, seeing a lot of hypes and a lot of disillusions as well. So maybe that's also teaching you something, that what is the reality then. Okay, but let's go forward to the experiences that we have. Should I?
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
It's my fault, Lisa.
Maybe something to change the slides. Okay. Yes. Okay, and just to get started, I think we already heard something about PSD2. And this is a very basic model of what PSD2 means. So on the left-hand side, there is the pre-PSD2 access to accounts era, where banks have monopoly to the customer interface on payment accounts. And then on the right-hand side, we have the PSD2 era model, where banks can still continue serving the customers in the service layer environment, so-called. But then there are also TPPs, third-party providers that are sharing that space with banks. And what does it mean is that like these TPPs, they need to have a payment institution license. They can be payment initiation service providers or account information service providers. I'll come back to this in a minute. And then there is another one, the third one, which is payment instrument issuing, which is also possible according to the PSD2, which means that the TPP can issue a card-based payment instrument to a bank's account. And another key thing is that the customer's consent is always required in order to do the things, in order to do a payment or get an account information service. And also the TPPs or banks cannot request TPPs to have a contract with the banks. And also communication is based on APIs. And as we've been hearing, PSD2 requires a strong customer authentication. As you might know, PSD2 as a directive has been set by the Commission and Parliament. And then they've mandated European Banking Authority to make the regulatory technical standards and guidelines. And the interesting fact, which we're not going into very deep today, is that actually only 6 out of the 11 of those are ready at the moment. And PSD2 is coming to first in January. So January is the deadline. So it's not an optimal way of working when we don't know the rules yet. And that is causing some interesting discussions and debates in the industry. So then to our experiences and what we are doing in the bank. Nordea is the biggest bank in the Nordics, and we are actually in middle of a big simplification project as well. So we're actually the only European bank that is totally renewing the core systems, the payment systems, and also the data warehouses. And actually, PSD2, in my opinion, is a very good thing for the bank, because that has forced us to rethink our strategy towards customers, and it's really putting the customer in the middle. So customer is the king, and open banking is providing our customers access to their data through a set of applications. Part of those are built by the bank, part of those are built by partners, and potentially anyone who has a license to do so. So it's opening up. Okay, then to the AISPs and PISPs. So there are some two new kids in the block. And on the left-hand side, you have a drawing. Okay, what does it mean, the PISP model? In the old world, the four-corner model, which is the card business model, there is a customer's bank and the acquirer's bank, the merchant's bank and the customer's bank. And now, in the new world, there is a PISP, which is sitting in the middle. Then, on the right-hand side, you have the account information, as was stated by Dave, two separate things, which we have to keep also separate. The other one is payment, the other one is information services. So if I today have accounts in three separate banks, I need to use three separate interfaces to access the information. With an AISP, I can have one interface to access this information. So that's the basics. Then, to a little bit more strategic approach. Where we started, okay, what are the alternatives then for a bank? Because with PSD2, banks are disrupted. That's the fact, as we've been discussing already. So, as Dave already mentioned, with providing only the APIs, so with the number one model, the basic compliance, nobody is going to make any money. Or at least the bank is not going to make any money. And that's not a revenue generating model. And of course, that's up to every single bank what strategic option they select. But if you select the option of only being compliant and only providing the APIs for AIS and PIS as requested by the law, then that's it. Then there is a couple of other options strategically, as I can see it. So you can develop more advanced APIs and actually open more than requested. And then you are creating services with partners. So that's a revenue sharing business model then with the fintech partners. They say, okay, the regulation is requiring that we open this, but actually we are opening more, and then you can make better services for the customers and everybody is benefiting. So it's a win-win-win situation. Then the third option is that you become a TPP yourself. So the upper ones here are in the customer interface. So they are really in the customer-facing position. So there you continue to be in the customer relationship and become a TPP, become an aggregator yourself. Then the right-hand side, the number 4, is even more far-reaching. So it is establishing an open ecosystem. So becoming an ecosystem player. So there you are in the customer interface, you are orchestrating the ecosystem, and you're actually focusing on building a vast network of external partners and adding value to your customers by integrating your APIs to shopping journeys and supply chains and the customer processes. Because in the future, what I believe is important is that the payment is deeply integrated in the customer process. It's not a separate thing, because nobody is waking up in the morning saying that I want to pay something today. We want to purchase something, we want to do something else, and payment needs to be integrated in the process. Okay, that's the strategic approach. Then some examples of what we have done in the area. We have actually been testing in all of these 3 more advanced, and actually in all of these areas. So in the premium APIs, we have actually launched already an auto FX service, which is utilizing premium APIs. And it is an automated currency conversion engine, just as an example. Then another example, we're also looking into the overlay and aggregator space, and looking into how can we become a TPP ourselves, and how can we start aggregating actually services and the customer and company payments data also from other financial institutions. So we're looking into building and proof of concept into that space as well. Then another interesting thought is to build an app store. So there has been a lot of discussion about the speed of development, and that is one essential problem. If we develop the services ourselves internally at Nordea, it might take 6 months or a year or really months to years, usually, a development project. But if we go for an app store model, actually what we are hearing from our fintech partners is that at the fastest it is a matter of hours. So it's really speeding up the development process, which we believe that is going to be very, very good for our service system. So then, how does it work in practice? Just an animation. So the customer is always in charge. That's important to remember. So it starts by so the partner is developing an app, and it starts by that. And then the customer is downloading the app from the App Store, and the customer is then authorizing the app, and a token is provided. And then we are validating the token and then providing the data. And then after that, information is presented in the app. This is an example of an AIS service. So it's very straightforward and simple, and we have thought through the processes for how to do that. Okay, so then how are we doing it with the partners? In practice, we have actually we're holding open banking focused fintech events where we are actually kickstarting the development. So we are spread in all across the Nordics. So we have these events locally in all of the main cities in the frequent intervals, and usually it's a couple of like 35, 60 representatives, and we try to make it a balanced event where we then of course present our strategy and then have the dialogue and try to understand what's happening in the industry and how can we do business together and how can we make this work. Then, okay, just a little bit about the history as well, like how did we get there? During the springtime, we opened the portal. So we announced that we're going to open banking, and we opened the website, and we started to take in registrations to our open banking portal. It took actually 3 days for us to get 350 registrations to the portal. So 350 companies wanted to do business with us within 3 days. And then after 2-3 weeks, we had more than 700 registered companies in the portal. It was much bigger amount than we ever expected. So I think that's also proving that there is a huge interest towards open banking and towards the collaboration and the collaborative model. So far, what we have done during the summer, we did some pilots, some technical pilot activities, and now we already have technical pilots with real data. And then we opened a sandbox, and we let all the developers who wanted to go to the sandbox. So now they are in the sandbox. They're testing with dummy data, and before the year end, we are going with the real data also in the sandbox. It's initially household accounts and corporate accounts are planned early next year. So that's how it works. So it's very straightforward and simple. And yeah, I think that was what I wanted to share. So I think back to our role, I think payments is trust business, and that's where we want to be also in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. We all see that bigger banks have life after Open API. You're very optimistic. You sounded very optimistic. Do we have any questions to Lisa? I have a very small question. Can we use the microphone? I can't hear. We have to have questions from the audience first and then panelists. I'll ask my question in Russian. Could you introduce yourself? Anton Switch from Swязьbank. It is a revolution in a way in payments. How did it impact the bank's business model, and where is the profits? You generate revenues from transactional business. The transactional business will be going. What will supplant it? What will reimburse it?
That's a very, very good question, and I've been actually working on that topic for several years now, and I'm trying to understand where is the world going. So, very good question. I think we, as a bank, we have to redefine the model. There is no going back. And in this kind of situations, I think the best way is not to prevent the change to happen, but to be the first ones in the change. So if you have to jump to the river, jump there first. Because then you will learn. By doing, you will learn, and you will also recognize. And that's why also we are actually starting to explore. We're going close to the fintechs. We were starting to understand how does it work and where is the business. We have a lot of ideas and thoughts on that. That okay, it could be it could be this, or it could be something else. But we're testing the hypothesis that we have all the time in the market. We're getting our hands dirty. We're going there and getting started. And I think that that's the best way to go forward, that you have to get started and try to understand what's in the market. So I don't have a definite answer, but I think we're trying to understand it.
Коллеги, у нас, к сожалению, было время только на один вопрос, но вы все...
We only have time for one question at this moment, but at the end of the panel discussion, you'll have another opportunity. Now I want to move on to Gavin. And my question to him is, in which way implementation of different approaches to open banking in the United States or United Kingdom are different from the continental Europe?
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to start my presentation by examining the three big myths of open banking. The first myth is that an API is somehow a business strategy. It is not. An API is a tool. It would be like opening up a restaurant based on the quality of the fork. You need to be thinking about developing clearly with the business opportunity in mind, centered around the customer for open banking to work. It is entirely customer-centric, entirely consent-driven. The second big lie is that open banking is new. Open banking is not new. Open banking has been evolving for at least 20 years. And the business models that are established in open banking have led us to the point where we now regulate it because it became big and important, and we could see all of the value that we could drive to the customers by enabling it. And the third big lie that I want to attack is that nowhere in the second Payment Services Directive does it mention API. It just doesn't exist. And people are always equating APIs in the context of PSD2 now. So, why have we chosen now to regulate open banking? Well, the problem was the liability model. The liability of the customer and how we make the customer whole is the issue. And it's still an issue which the regulation hasn't fully resolved. The starting point, though, is in the payments use case, in the Payment Services Directive, that's called Payment Initiation Services. And in Lisa's diagram, we saw in Payment Initiation Services the fact that the relationship between the consumer and the merchant bypasses the rails of the card schemes and goes bank to bank. Now, typically, that service has been alive in the open market using credential sharing. The credential sharing is using effectively the internet banking passwords to impersonate the customer and to then move in and enable the payment. Now, typically in the payment initiation space, that activity was done effectively during the first establishment of the connection and subsequently is made easier where effectively the let's call it the fintech actor, the payment initiator, effectively uses the customer's credentials and then stores them. In the account information side, organizations like Yodlee and CashEdge set up in 1999. And it was always the banks that went first in the US market. In the US market, you could go into your Bank of America account and see your Citigroup account at the same time. And you've been able to do that for coming on for 20 years. I want to get back, though, to this liability issue. Because at the end of the day, as this marketplace has grown, one customer, one human being, could have connections to a single bank account for dozens of applications. And if something goes wrong, how do we make the customer whole? How do we know whether the customer consented to have that data shared? How do we know which entity lost the data? So that led us to the regulation of this. In the payments use case, it is always the bank that makes the customer whole in the first instance. Then they have the opportunity to turn to the fintech and say, you know what, we think you messed up. We think that that you generated a false payment and that you made the mistake and you now make us whole. The Payment Services Directive also has the requirement for the fintech in either actor to have liability insurance in place. Now, there's one thing everybody must understand about insurance. The insurance company is under contract not to pay out unless liability can be established. So in Russia, when you start to think about how you're moving to deliver open banking, you have to start in that position because you need to be able to assess and trace who the bad actor was in the chain. And there could be multiple parties in the chain holding the data. In the account information services, so these are companies that have been offering everything from personal financial management applications right through to the wonderfully rich new methods of scoring customers for credit applications. You know, in open banking, at the end of the last banking crisis, everybody turned around and said some of the customers that were sold mortgages couldn't afford to pay for them. Now, one of the wonderful advantages in the open banking world is that that won't happen because you have a precise income and expense appraisal of the customer, accurate to the penny and accurate as of today. And you properly categorize how they spend and how they earn. It totally rips up the historical credit model. And in the account information space, the liability model is reversed. When the data has been transferred to a regulated actor and the data is now at rest in that regulated actor, it's that regulated actor that has to make the customer whole if something goes wrong, not the bank. The bank is off the hook. The bank has only to land the data in the right place. In order to do that, they have to make sure that, firstly, the company that comes to collect the data is a regulated actor, and secondly, they have to make sure that the end customer consented for the data to go there. After that, they wash their hands of the whole thing. The Payment Services Directive is role-based. To Lisa's earlier point, you could be in more than one role. You could be the bank that sends the data out and then switch sides and be the third-party provider. Now, in the UK market, we had a look at some of the issues emerging of how we managed to firstly make sure that we only handed the data to regulated actors. And we thought, okay, well, we need to have a directory, a central directory that has all of the regulated actors on it. And you know what? If a company that's on that regulated list is in breach of any of the covenants under which they were granted permission to be in the market, we can simply unplug them. The regulator says, hey, that fintech we now withdraw from the market until they fix the problem. And all we have to do to disconnect them from access is simply remove their directory permission. Because when the company comes to the directory, we issue them with a token. The real advantage, though, of open banking in the way it has been envisaged in the UK is that it was built to a standard. A fintech company can build one time and connect into every bank. And the banks all build to a compliant standard. It actually makes a lot of things easier and more sensible. If you think about not just the technical overhead, but the risk overhead, you have to have penetration testing, you have to have security audits, you have to have all of these things as part of your application process. And if you've got 60 different connection layers to 60 different banks, it just increases the volume of money that goes to the security auditor. And then you have a liability insurance sitting behind this, right? Well, the liability insurance has to understand the risk they're entering into. So if there's clear standards, then it makes it easier to stand up the whole liability model and eventually to make the customer whole. And I want to contrast that because in the US market, and bearing in mind, open banking started in the US, they're now in a very difficult position because the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency has, part of the legislative framework for that, has meant that any company that connects to any company that connects technically to a bank ends up being supervised by the bank, which means the liability model is really unclear. And in fact, when the data goes across the fence and lands in the fintech, there is still the suggestion that the bank is still on the hook. So they then have to supervise it, which means it's introduced commercial relationships and bilateral spaghetti. The whole market has, Wells Fargo doing a deal with this fintech and Bank of America doing a deal with that fintech to open up some kind of API and some sort of supervision layer. It's just not the way to go. If they had their way again and they'd understood where this would lead, they would certainly have gone for standards. And my appeal in coming to Russia is that we actually need to have international standards for open banking. We should collaborate in the governance, in the liability model and the technical layer, and make sure that these services across the world are interoperable. And in that way, we increase innovation, we increase the sharing of best practice, and I think, all told, it leads us to a better place. Thank you very much.
Gavin, спасибо.
Thank you, Gavin. So very accurate opinion, which coincides with the opinions of the other experts that regarding the implementation of APIs, well, the lack of standards, universal, which leads to all sorts of connections and irregular connection, and so the protection of consumer rights and the security of data. And are there any questions to Gavin? Then let me ask him one question. To what extent the approaches in Europe, in the European payment and directive on payments, the payment directives, and then the second data protection directive are synchronized?
That's a really interesting question, Boris, and thank you for that. So the issue really here is the general data protection regulations were designed with one thing in mind, and that was really to prevent nuisance calls from marketers. Right? And when you share your data with a company, that the company tells you what they're going to do with the data, and of course nobody signs up to get nuisance calls. And but because it was universal, it has also caught the banking sector unhelpfully, because now we have regulated actors whose requirement to treat a customer fairly is to get as much information about the customer as possible, and when we sell them a product, keep it forever. And the general data protection regulations are about data minimization and only taking the amount of data that you need, and you have the right to be forgotten and delete various things. So they don't sit very nicely with each other. And the big issue actually comes back into liability. Where they are in common is that they're both consent-driven. So again, we're designing access around customers, not around banks' provision, not around products. We're designing around customers, and the customers say, I want to have this. The problem becomes when in the account information service provision model, the data lands in the fintech and the bank washes its hands of the data, whether the general data protection regulations forces the bank back over the neat, clean divide back into liability because there's been some element of the consent chain which the customer hasn't properly gathered. So if I had my way, which I definitely don't, I would have had financial services excluded from the general data protection regulation. They're just too hard to reconcile from a liability model perspective, in my view.
Да, конечно.
I'm not sure if the audience, I just want to amplify one thing you said, because I wasn't sure if the audience understand what a gigantic, catastrophic mess the interaction of open banking and GDPR is. It is absolutely unresolvable at the moment for a couple of reasons. Suppose I am a TPP and I go to Gavin and I say to Gavin, can I look at your transactions? I'm going to give you a better deal on car insurance or whatever, okay? So I download the transactions from Gavin's account. But Gavin has been sending money to Olga. So when I download, this is just a hypothetical example, obviously. So when I download, I hope, I don't know if so when I download the transactions from Gavin's account, I see that he has sent money to Olga. But he consented under GDPR for me to look at his data, but Olga didn't consent. So now I have consent to look at his data, but now I'm in violation of the GDPR because now I'm looking at Olga's data, which she didn't give consent for. So in order to try to deal with this, the UK banks have instituted a system of redaction, which actually is quite clever, but it's a gigantic hassle on top. So when I go to his account and I ask, can I see your transactions? His account doesn't say Carrefour, or, it doesn't say that, you know what I mean? They have numbers, meaningless numbers, which are I can't think what the word for them is. What do you call them? They're pseudonymous identifiers that are meaningless but consistent.
So yeah.
You see what I mean? But it's a huge problem and it's not resolved.
And it's very frustrating because all of the lovely business models emerging from this open banking movement require the data not to be redacted for them to work. I mean, if you have a personal financial management thing and you've got this section which says we don't know what that is.
Which is everything.
Yeah, and of course, one of the requirements of mortgage lending, just going back to my earlier point, is that you take something like 6 months worth of bank statements into the lender and you show them how you're earning and spending. Now, if you can imagine turning up at the bank, having been through that with a felt tip pen and scoring through half of it and saying, I'd like you to look at my bank statement and lend me, a lot of money, but I'm not telling you what's going on, the bank would say no. So most of these business models are enriched by having high quality data, deeply categorized, so they really understand you and how you use your money. Not just with one provider, but across all of your bank accounts and credit cards, right? It's a full picture of your financial self and financial history. And that is the value of them. So to David's point, try to avoid tangling yourself in knots on the privacy side because it doesn't lead to good outcomes for customers.
Спасибо за эту дискуссию. Я думаю, что действительно вы подчеркнули важность.
Thank you for this discussion because you have mentioned the importance of harmonization of the financial legislation and the legislation that protects personal data, and which is very important. And now let's move further east, and let me ask the question of Ekaterina. Ekaterina represents the largest bank in the Russian Federation, which has built a very successful and frankly speaking, quite isolated ecosystem. And so why Sberbank is thinking, and whether it's thinking at all, about open banking? Thank you very much, Boris, for your question. And so our bank is really large, and it seems that nothing could prevent this flagship to sail forward. Nevertheless, we have examined the API situation, and actually it's not the self-purpose for us. Sberbank, as a market player, is redefining its own status, whether it's a bank or not a bank, whether it's an ecosystem or not, and how this ecosystem lives within the existing world, and so it requires certain tools for cooperation with the outside external world. And strictly speaking, answering your question, I would say whether we have whether the traditional sources of income become depleted once the API comes in, then what are they? And so such models, for instance, can be found with providers, such market players as SaaS or PaaS providers, and we saw a window of opportunities for ourselves, which in the Russian environment looks as a blue ocean. Why? Because it's very good, it's wonderful to follow the route of full reproduction of the experience of providing information about the account balances and about the transactions and the payments, the possibility of making payments. So it's just gives an impression that we have opened up and we are moving forward. But at the same time, we would like to have a broader view at the situation, because the epoch of cooperation with APIs, that's the face of any business, not only information on payment services, but also information about means on accounts, but it's information that can be provided as the software services. And right now we have acquired certain experience, and Sberbank right now is reiterating maybe the experience of some other market players. We are just connecting outside APIs and suppliers of such services. That would look harmonious unless we had the feeling that we cannot expect a constantly growing margin and rate of return. In about 5 or 7 years' time, we would feel like a runner that's already out of breath, but it has to reach the finishing line because we are not the exclusive, the only provider of such services in the market. So either we provide unique services or such services would be provided by different agents. And so we've got to think of a new model when this bank should transform itself into an ecosystem actor or player, because such ecosystems would be cooperating, collaborating with one another. And here I would like to mention another point which affects not just Sberbank as a market player, but the entire industry. It's very important to reach an agreement about rules. Like, let's say in football, there are certain rules and all the players understand their position in the field and what they do in the field. The same applies to the ecosystem formation. And so the players should have a standard, first and foremost. We're trying to do that exactly. So it can be built on the safe services, information-based services, so that would see these corners that we can hit when we move along certain paths, and in particular when we talk about sensitive areas, because if the bank or the client that owns such data, we are not talking about the technical implementation, while API, it's a tool, it's a technical implementation, and so it must become quite a high-capacity mechanism that ensures interaction between players in the field. And here I see the role of Sberbank as not exclusively one or entity that is just a market player that chose the route of opening a sandbox and then develop experience and as a new form of interacting with the market, but as the creator of the standards of interaction that would bring us not only to broader cooperation within this country, but even across the borders, because in the next 10 or 15 years' time, the school children of today, they would become the generation of the people or citizens of the world. And in this respect, it's very important to migrate from the position of a small island to a bigger island, then a bigger island to mainland, and or let's say bigger continent, and then the globe on the whole. And the question is, why are we doing that? There are two drivers. First driver is just to find new distribution channels for ourselves and to form and to accumulate certain experience for future breakthrough. And the driver number two is just to exceed the existing coordination system. And so that's the task of the bank, because we are using various M&A transactions, and that's very important as far as cooperation with the other market players goes. Why it's important? Because the customer is one and the same, because the customers would be setting demands that we would be governed by. And so the interrelation between Sberbank and other service providers, that's something different. But we have to start moving before we find in a situation when we have a deficit of our own margins. Thank you, Catherine. It's a very important point of view, an important stand of Sberbank, because without Sberbank, our API would not be open, but only slightly opened. We have to move forward. Unfortunately, we don't have time for any more other questions. And so your company came in the limelight of mass media, and that's not what I want to discuss right now, but I would like to ask you about your unique experience, because you have implemented an open API from both sides. On the one hand, as the open API consumer, that's your experience with the bank Открытие and Kiwi. On the other hand, you are a provider of services for the Rocket Bank. And so what obstacles have you already identified? Thank you very much. Our story, our experience is even richer, because I remember in 2011, when there was, Bank VTB24 jointly with the ELBA service, thinking about the customer. Well, actually, I'm not inspired by the API and marketplace conversations, because, clients or customers don't wake up in the morning and they just start thinking, there's something lacking in the API sphere, whatever. Why don't I visit the bank webpage and offer something and think about something new? And so all the customers have their own lives that they live. And so what we decided to do is just to marry our customers with the financial office at the bank. And so that we decided to cut the costs relating to such payments. And so within 6 months, we had only 100 customers, and certainly it was a failure, and we decided to close it down. But later on, we invented the service button, and so sort of a bank and a lawyer and legal advice or lawyer, and also accountant. That's about 10 rubles. 10,000 rubles per month, and then we decided to add to this three persons also account, let's say the maintenance of account, and then the same amount of money, and the response was totally different. Why so cheaply? Why it's so cheap? And so strange as it may seem, but people don't think that bank is the center of their personal universes, and API is a very important thing which makes it possible for us to reach with the service that they really need to them. So that was our first experience. The start was not successful, but after this story or experience with 24, we actually received some feedback from the customers. The customers asked us not to stop and continue with our work, and so we decided to think about that, how to provide services suitable for customers and make bank services and the behavior of the bank fully compliant. And certainly we understand that certainly we can have a portal to an account, to transactions, but we cannot have, let's say, this route to currency control. And so in Bank 24, we were very proud, and now we're very proud at Открытие that Russia has the longest payment day, because we understand that banks have different branches which are located in various hour belts, and consequently the payment day is very long. We understand that this is a very temporary competitive edge. Just several more steps on the part of Открытие Bank and the Sberbank, we would no longer have the longest payment day. And what would remain? Very little. And then the format that we have selected regarding the API, which the other banks borrowed and decided to use for themselves, that's bank within a bank. The entire technological pile is something that we provide on our own, I take the stand of the users, and so when you have that there is a separate licensing bank, then there is, let's say, a processing center, you receive the API, and then you have a chance to collect your service as you wish, as you will. And so this proved to be quite a flexible approach, architecture, and we were fully launched up within 20 days from scratch to the full implementation. So that's it's not exactly API, because that's a closed loop contour. architecture. And then the same story we saw with the Rocket Bank, and so in Rocket Bank has apps, has marketing, has CRM, and but at that time they didn't have ABS and they didn't have their own processing services, and the technological point actually was developed in such a way that we have found some room for the Rocket Bank within our architecture. And again, these guys managed to launch their project until the white plastic stage within 20 days. So we're talking about this matryoshka, or doll within a doll, and so there are services. There's a certain shell, then there are providers and banks that are included into this service. But we reached a stage when it was became difficult for us to provide our services, and it was not the problem. The problem was not the API. The people wanted to customize their own services, and I felt really awful because there is always this conflict, because this is your business that you want to develop, and so these are your tasks and obligations as a service providers vis-a-vis a bunch of clients, and this is a difficult choice, but very often people make a choice in favor of their personal businesses. Unfortunately, that's a tragedy that lots of banks will have to face with fintech companies, unless they are specialized service providers, because they always have to make this choice: who I'm going to invest, who am I going to pay for such services. Some unknown fintech startup, which in my total scope of payments and investments and funding is just 0.01% or even less. And so the matter is the flexibility, and so Точка.ru did provide such services for a certain period of time. And then a new idea came to us, that's multi-banking services. And so banks say that these are my clients. For instance, if can you find a client in the street, anyone, any person whom we meet outside, and say that I belong only to this bank? Yes, here are all the plastic cards in my wallet, and that's why I would never trade this bank for anybody else. But this is not true. Certain banks tend to think about their clients as their property, which they own. But clients, on the other hand, they try to shop around and find the best offer from the banks. So what the idea was, why don't we give clients a chance to change banks without actually changing such banks? So an average Russian entrepreneur, and we made certain comparison of data, then they have, let's say, 1.5 or 5 banks. Then they read some new things about the new offers, and they go to another bank and they change their servicing bank. And so we again understood that we cannot give an interface to currency control. There are some banks that are ready to provide interface and access to transactions, but not to the currency control. And so, for instance, when individual entrepreneurs use the only bank account with only bank, and they go to ATM, and the card is removed by this ATM, something happens, and that's the only money that he had on his account. And so here, at this point, the service wins. But whatever API, whatever form API takes, we have to take the risk, to assume the risk that, well, we have to pay our client this money, and later on we will clear up this mess with the ATM and with the recovered card. And so now we started this experiment working with two balances when from one interface people can receive service either here or there. And we hope that several more banks will join this experiment. Technically, it works as a branch with its own content, and banks have their own content, but nevertheless everybody accepts that the client has the right to choose, and on the one hand the clients would receive good quality services, and on the other hand all the providing banks would be offering their products, and they could start selling such products to all those who are currently not the clients of this bank. And so I think that API, it just must be. And on the other hand, the real processes of support, which are more complicated than just sending a payment slip and make a payment and then receive information on this transaction, they are far more serious. I don't really believe that a payment service can be or can create some uniqueness. Maybe some new neobanks, they are creating new improved processes, trying to add value to the customer. But what really is important, that's data collection. And so, we hope that we don't have the same data protection standards that we see in other countries. So data must be collected from different sources and create more currencies for the clients, because the business idea, the correct price for this, these are more important than the API and the technical means of implementation. Well, we would like to integrate everything into one bundle, but if the client, if we talk only about the price or services, the clients would not be interested. But customers may be attracted that I have an account, a settlement account in this bank, and a mortgage a loan in a different bank, and I would like to receive some other services, let's say to place a deposit with a third bank. And I think that's the future regarding this platform. Thank you very much. That's why I love Boris, because he's just the embodiment of the saying that optimists, all the dreams of optimists come true, and all the nightmares of pessimists unfortunately also come true for them. But we can discuss later on. And now we have a very important presentation from the sponsor, Vyacheslav. So strictly speaking, it's all very serious. We've been talking about financial aspects of the API, and Rostelecom has done a lot in broadening the life boundaries of API. Maybe he would speak about the convergence of financial and non-financial APIs. And I'm Rostelecom and the head of the digital office in this company. It's a totally new entity or unit. We're set up only on the 1st of January, and so we nevertheless managed to make a lot of progress. So this is a retail brand, and so this is every seventh user of paid TV services is our client. And as for the internet users, we have approximately 13.5 million users. And so we represent a huge retailer in the telecom and Bash Telecom and Rosonline, and we have lots of other our daughter companies. And so this digital office is a very interesting structure. And originally it was just an internal lab that was focused on the issue of our own divergent digital services and platforms. We've got to understand that there is no magic here, and well, unfortunately, we are not talking about magic, but about the hammer. And so this hammer was invented several years ago. It was done by the Swagger Group and the designers, and that's the only what they invented. And so, but on top of that, there should be a business idea, and on top of business idea, we've got to have empathy, because in Russia, soul is very important, and this presence of soul within any business is a critical thing. And so if we talk further, then how do we understand the digital economy? How it divided into three components, critical components, which are very transparent, easy to understand services for clients. For instance, to send a demand regarding a bank, and so it would be just a request. So the request went off. We studied the history. Usually there are 6 or 7 points of contact between the bank and the client. Then, somebody just will has to use a text or email confirmation, etc. And sometimes, the client should not be troubled, and we should not complicate things for the customer. The customer should feel very comfortable within this digital space that he has accessed. And again, companies may be different, retail companies and other. There are different regulations and rules of conduct and etc., which is also very important. And third, that's the platform for collaboration. And I will give you a specific example. As Boris, I worked for Открытие Bank, and I have acquired lots of new ideas, and I received very useful experience, and we were launching Aeroflot cards and UTEA. For instance, there are UTEA and Aeroflot air companies, and have their own plastic card products. And basically, we have to collect the same kind of data from from the two airlines. And so that was basically there. UTEA had acquired their own experience, and they had their own format of collecting and sending data to us, and the same applies to Aeroflot. And so every time I had to reinvent the wheel, and 30% of my costs, in financial costs and time costs, it was this reiteration and replication of the same data. The same applies to Lukoil, which when I started working with the Lukoil, and we requested client profiles from them, and then we try to reiterate. And so the collaboration between different platforms. If there is a single platform that even we all become open AAPs, then what would happen to all of us? So PSD2, that's the elephant which we can see in Europe. That's the end service. It's focused on payments only. And so PSD2, it's just it's all the everything that we buy. That's digital games and then contents. It's outside this this format, and so the banks and operators and providers of financial services are divided here, and the collaboration platform is called the electronic ledger or electronic register of all these payments, and so all the client data, their consent to process such personal data, and the access rights, etc. So this is a platform. I haven't seen it physically. It's very interesting to see what it looks like. It seems to be a mythical platform, but nevertheless, that's in Europe. That's the regulator that's responsible for that. Well, in Europe, in the EU, there is, let's say, European committee responsible payments for payments, and that's something that we try to do. We understood that we have 87 and payment systems. All in all, there are about 500 such systems, and so we had to bring them afford to the service. And so when in Bank Открытие we were creating this service of a company within a company, we in this particular office, they created their own platform within Rostelecom. They made their internal platform, and then just look. We're happy to inform you that company Rostelecom has launched a unique digital platform that helps save on the development of digital services and products and makes simpler their utilization. Now, sites, chatbots, and mobile apps and various services can be created easily, quickly, and effectively within the scope of this platform. They can prototype, unfold, and administer such apps without the special setting for this infrastructure. Everything, all the settings are in place. But besides that, in addition to the infrastructure and technical tools, within this platform, you can see business services of Rostelecom, like the control of options and services, the balance account balance, switching on to partner services, and many. This called a digital sandbox, and this platform has been used for 1 year very successfully within the company Rostelecom, and in order to launch online translation, CDS, and services for payments using various bank data, insurance products, and other services. Digital sandbox helped significantly optimize the digitalization of the company, and that's why Rostelecom decided to share its experience using this platform with you. Very soon we are launching a pilot project of this sandbox, and just follow the news, and the news of Rostelecom. So this story is quite interesting. So next week we are going to host a business breakfast and make a presentation about this particular platform. And so digital sandbox, everything is built as a service. Our source and our infrastructure are our own, and the platform works as a PaaS, platform as a service, vis-a-vis our systems and vis-a-vis services that come from above. Besides, we have internal and external services, and where we can connect to external partners' services and partners' internal services. On the whole, we would like to introduce such a new approach, which is called proof as a service, when the piloting of new ideas and products must be done at a click of the fingers. And when we discuss these points, and when you are discussing all the APIs, when you try to get connected, and you spend 6 months to do that, and then at a certain corner you understand that you have hurt your knee, and something didn't click in place. We have to taste. So we decided to start with this internal platform, and then when we have streamlined this platform, we understood that it's really very good, because there is soul in this platform, and once there is this soul in this platform, in this product, it should be very good for other people in the market as well. And so we want to take a startup, so when the startup is not just emerging, but when it's already live and kicking, when the product is already it's generating products, and when we would be then promoting it to the federal level of Rostelecom. We don't want just to open an API. We want to help create a convergence environment for the development of such products. And our national operators quite frequently say that we can become a national operator with this case, with the story behind us in our portfolio. Thank you very much, Vyacheslav. Thanks a lot. And I think we already have exceeded our time frame, but maybe we have time for 3 questions. There's one person who was first in line. Good afternoon. I hope that Yuri Minaev, KPF, and I will ask my question in English, and this question is to Lisa.
Project very well, very nice, it's future, I understand, but I ask you about, ex-compliance officer in ING Bank. And what think your national AML-CFT regulator about this platform, yes? Does it happy or unhappy? Because, I'm FAT 40+9 rules recommendation in action, yes, and they not want to cancel it, yes. And what you think about FATF opinion about your platform in future, especially about identification, yes. And second part of my question, what do you think your compliance division and internal control division of this? Are they improve it or disapprove or just watching a moment about this project? So, thanks.
Okay, I'm not sure whether I understood it correctly, the first part, but which compliance?
Yes, what think your AML-CFT against money laundering, countering financial terrorism regulator on this platform, on this project?
It's a very, very good question. I think, of course, the AML regulation is there and it doesn't go anywhere.
Yes.
So, and I think that's one of the key reasons why we prefer to have it in a controlled way and in an API way, so that we are fully aware who is coming to our API. Is it the end user or end customer, or is it the TPP? And then there needs to be registers, and there needs to be the system needs to cater for that. And that's why we're also doing pilots and collecting the experiences with dummy data before we go to real data. Yes. The other question was regarding the
internal division, especially compliance and customer audit service.
Yes.
What they think about?
Yes.
Are they involved? Sorry, are they involved in process?
Yes, of course they need to be involved, and of course we need to be compliant in two ways. Of course, we have loads of other compliance, but then we have also PSD2 compliance. So we need to be also PSD2 compliant, and so that's of course the balancing but yes, of course they are like for instance Nordea is a big bank. We have 10 million customers, and big banks, when they start changing that, the start is low, but once the chip started to move, it's not so easy to stop it.
Спасибо. Нет, все. Теперь Ильман задает вопрос. Вы уже два задали.
Спасибо. Ильман Мертьев, Ассоциация российских банков. Вопрос прежде всего...
Association of Russian Banks, and my question is to the Russian panelists and PSD2 and everything. Boris, thank you for PSD2 that you have raised this topic. Because, well, PSD2 believes that the owner, the client, is the owner of data is the client. But the question is, are you ready to pay the owner of data for the use of his or her data? Can I take this question? Well, the data-related topic is very sensitive. Every company has a customer base, and depending upon the size of this customer base, some are large, some are smaller, but they generate certain tracks or traces, and certainly such companies would try to monetize this information because, you remember then in some time ago, when the database from Sberbank's clients, they somehow were linked to McDonald's, etc. And McDonald's didn't suffer; it's Sberbank that suffered, and because and so yes, certainly the client is the owner of the data, and no one can challenge that. But the sharing of data is a very sensitive issue because who can suffer? That's the providing company and the sharing and the technical company rather than the end user. And so I don't think I am ready to pay by services. Well, yes, by services. Not cross sales, but services. Okay, Anton. Will you please take this microphone? Moscow Exchange. The question is to foreign experts, so I will speak in English.
To international experts, what we think from an exchange or from an investment banking perspective, that the issues you are discussing regarding the traditional commercial banking systems are very similar to what the investment banking went through over the past 10 years. So my question to you is, what do you think will be the key differences here? Because the investment banking and investment services have been disintermediated heavily. What are going to be the key difference in the processes we are currently going through in the commercial banking area?
Well, I would answer that by looking at two different trends. So one is regulatory and one is the business trend. So on the regulatory side, the regulatory pressures in Europe and the UK are to regulate banking, credit institutions, payment institutions and investment institutions quite separately. So as those regulatory regimes begin to separate further because of the ring, we call it the ring fencing, and I'm not sure how much of the business models will be universal anymore anyway. So that kind of disintermediation on the retail side, you're talking about things like Zopa and Cabbage and Lending Club and Prospect, and they will have the same impact on the retail side. I'm more confident about the ability of some of our banking clients to retain market share because, as I said in my presentation, I think the new retail banking services that will come into existence around APIs, it won't be just API versions of the traditional banking services. And I feel strongly that there are services around trust and data analysis and so on, which will enable the retail banks to stay in the loop with customer transactions. So I don't think it will follow quite that same trajectory. I will make one slight point, which is when we were talking before about and in fact your question reinforced the point, which is that you can't have an open banking service without an identity infrastructure. The two go hand in hand. But of course that identity infrastructure has to extend to organizations as well as individuals. And I think some of the complexities that we've fallen over in the UK, such as the directory of providers, I'm sure you will learn from that and it will be a smoother path in Russia. But you're right to highlight the issue. Yeah.
So from my perspective, start by putting the customer in the center of the page, and you'll find the customer is connected to their investments, to their pensions, to their mortgage, to their credit, every type of financial transaction, financial services transaction. And the open banking movement that has driven this thinks through that, thinks about the customer in that way. We expect, and the UK Treasury has already recently come out and publicly stated that they expect us to go beyond PSD2 and bring all of these other data assets into the same delivery channel. And I think that's a terrific opportunity for customers because your financial life is connected. I mean, just to make a very simple point, if you went to ask an advisor to give you pension advice and they didn't realize that you had a very expensive credit card that you hadn't paid off, they may be giving you the wrong advice because the correct thing to do would be to pay that off first. So when you think about the lens of the customer, they're connected to all of their financial universe, and the open banking delivery should encompass that.
I think, just to make one little point, he's a conservative person, I'm a very radical person. I think the future is more radical for the reason which was outlined in the previous panel chaired by Madam Deputy Governor, because remember, we're talking about connecting these APIs to the customers, but I'm a bank customer. I don't really want to deal with this stuff. It's too complicated. I don't understand it. I want the API to connect to my artificial intelligence. I want to connect the bank to something cleverer than me, something that's smarter than me to deal with all of these things. So when we talk about banks servicing customers through the APIs, in reality it's going to be like the bank artificial intelligence talking to my artificial intelligence through the APIs. So the sophistication of those APIs, I think, will accelerate faster. I'm more technological. I think technology will be faster.
Друзья, к сожалению, мы сейчас рискуем.
Friends, we are running the risks that the panelists would exceed the number of our audience. And so, well, I believe that you can ask the rest of your questions informally. Thank you very much for the organization of this panel.